This is basic civil defense information from the Department of Defense, Office of Civil Defense, Washington. If the United States should be attacked with nuclear weapons, it's almost certain that our networks of warning stations would detect incoming bombers or missiles in time for you to reach shelter or at least take cover. You may receive warning of an attack by radio, television, or through the outdoor warning system in your community. It's important that you learn to recognize the attack warning signal and not confuse it with any other. In most places, the standard attack warning signal is a 3 to 5 minute wavering sound or a series of short blasts on whistles, horns, or other devices. Either of these signals means that an actual enemy attack has been detected, and you should take protective action immediately. Find out from your local civil defense office the attack warning system that will be used in your community. This is basic civil defense information from the Department of Defense, Office of Civil Defense, Washington. If you receive warning of an enemy attack, get to the nearest fallout shelter promptly. But if you're caught in the open and there's a brilliant nuclear flash in the distance, take cover immediately. Even miles away, you may be exposed within seconds to a searing heat wave from the explosion, followed by a blast wave and flying debris. Get into the nearest building immediately or into a ditch or culvert, beneath a parked car, behind a tree or wall, anything solid that will give you some measure of protection. Curl up in a ball and cover your head with your arms. Stay there until heat and blast waves have passed. Then go to the nearest fallout shelter before radioactive fallout starts drifting down. If there's no fallout shelter within range, go to the nearest large building and take shelter in the basement or one of the inner hallways. Know in advance what to do in any emergency situation. Find out from your local civil defense office. This is basic civil defense information from the Department of Defense, Office of Civil Defense, Washington. Wherever you go, whatever you do, it's always wise to keep an eye open for the black and yellow public fallout shelter signs. Each one marks a place that's been thoroughly checked for proper shielding against radioactive fallout, and in many cases already stocked with emergency food rations, water, and basic survival equipment. Knowing where the nearest one is could save you crucial minutes in time of emergency. If your local government has instructed you to go to a specific public shelter in event of nuclear attack, find out exactly where it's located and the best way to reach it promptly. Check on whether there's a shelter in or near your child's school, and if not, find out what other actions would be taken by the school authorities to protect him in emergency. In short, take time now to make a family emergency plan, and then make sure every member of your family knows it. This is basic civil defense information from the Department of Defense, Office of Civil Defense, Washington. If an enemy nuclear attack ever occurs, many areas of the nation would be threatened by radioactive fallout. If there is public shelter nearby, go to it. Or if you have a home shelter, use it, unless your local government has given you other instructions. But if regular shelter isn't available, and you have a house with a below-ground basement or storm cellar, you could still improvise some protection from radioactive fallout. In a basement, choose a corner most below ground and away from windows. Drag in a heavy bench or table to make a roof for your shelter. Cover it with trunks, stacks of firewood, flagstones, books, anything that is thick and heavy. Then wall yourself in on the two open sides with heavy appliances or dressers or chests backed with earth or sand to help absorb radiation. For more information on this and other ways to improvise protection from fallout, check with your local civil defense office. This is basic civil defense information from the Department of Defense, Office of Civil Defense, Washington. If a nuclear attack ever occurs, go to a public shelter if one is nearby, or if you have a home shelter, use it. But if regular shelter isn't available, and even if your home has no basement, you could still improvise some limited fallout protection in a first-floor hall or room, away from outer walls and windows. Use doors off their hinges, furniture and appliances, plus stacks of other shielding material, such as trunks or drawers, filled with sand or earth, to make an enclosure large enough to live in for a short time. Some homes without basements have a crawl space between the first floor and the ground. Select the crawl space area under the center of the house and place shielding material around it. On the floor above, place other shielding material to provide additional protection for the shelter space. For more information on how to improvise fallout protection, check with your local civil defense director. This is basic civil defense information from the Department of Defense, Office of Civil Defense, Washington. There's one easy, sensible thing your family should do to prepare for a possible time of emergency. Set aside a few simple, basic supplies you'll need to take to the public fallout shelter. supplies to help keep you and your family alive and well in event of enemy attack. For instance, any special medicines or diet foods required by members of the family, insulin, heart tablets, baby food, and other infant supplies, blankets, a battery-powered radio, a flashlight, extra batteries. And if the nearest public shelter hasn't been stocked yet with emergency rations and supplies, you'll need to take as much food and water as you can carry. Emergency supplies are needed for a private home shelter, too. Lay in enough food, canned or packaged and preferably pre-cooked, for 2 weeks, plus enough drinking water in tightly kept containers or jars to give each person at least a quart a day or more. For help in making up a list of needed supplies, consult your local Civil Defense office. This is basic civil defense information from the Department of Defense, Office of Civil Defense, Washington. If our nation ever comes under nuclear attack and you take shelter to protect yourself from radioactive fallout, water is the key emergency supply. Each person will need at least a quart a day, and if there's not enough water stored in your shelter, here are additional places to find it, especially if you plan to use a home shelter where you'll be on your own. Local authorities may instruct you to turn off the main water valve. When you do this, the pipes inside the house will still be full of water. Next, turn on the faucet located at the highest point in your house to let air into the system. Then use water from the faucet located at the lowest point in your house. You can also use water in your hot water heater, in the flush tanks, or water in ice cube trays, milk, soft drinks, canned juices. If necessary, you can even drink water that's been exposed to fallout. However, very young children should be given non-contaminated liquids when available. For more information, consult your local Civil Defense office.
This is basic civil defense information from the Department of Defense, Office of Civil Defense, Washington. If there is ever a nuclear emergency, special fire precautions should be taken, particularly if you plan to use a home shelter. Keep out the intense heat rays from a nuclear explosion by closing your doors, windows, and Venetian blinds. If you don't have Venetian blinds, coat windows with whitewash, household cleaning powder, even mud, or cover windows with aluminum foil. Unless authorities advise otherwise, fill buckets and bathtubs with water. Keep a garden hose connected. Fill containers with sand for firefighting. If it's an electrical fire, shut off the electricity first at the main switch, then put out the flame. If it's an oil or grease fire, shut off the supply of whatever is burning. Smother the flame. Don't use water. With a gas fire, shut off the gas supply. Then use water, sand, or earth to put out the fire. Act quickly. To know the danger of fire and what to do about it, consult your local Civil Defense Director.
This is basic civil defense information from the Department of Defense, Office of Civil Defense, Washington. Especially in time of emergency, think before you act and follow instructions by responsible authorities. You may receive warning of an attack by outdoor warning systems or by radio or television or even by word of mouth. Unless local officials have instructed you otherwise, go immediately to a public fallout shelter or to your home fallout shelter. Then tune your radio to any local station that is broadcasting and listen for official information. Follow whatever instructions are given. Don't use the telephone to obtain further information and advice about the emergency. Depend on radio, as the government will be broadcasting all the information it has available. The telephone lines will be needed for official calls. Help keep them open. Let me repeat. In time of emergency, for official government information and civil defense instructions, tune your radio to any local station that is broadcasting.
Here is basic information and guidance from the Office of Civil Defense, Department of Defense, Washington. In case of nuclear attack against the United States, loss of life would be much less if people are prepared to meet the emergency. You can give yourself and your family a much better chance of survival and recovery if you understand the basic hazards of nuclear attack. When a nuclear bomb or missile explodes, 4 things happen. First, an intense flash of light. Then, seconds later, the heat wave, followed quickly by a violent blast wave. And finally, if the weapon explodes at or near ground level, there will be radioactive fallout. People who happen to be close to a nuclear explosion, in the area of heavy destruction, probably would be killed or seriously injured by the blast or by the heat of the nuclear fireball. People a few miles away, in the fringe area of the explosion, probably would also be endangered by blast and heat, and by fires that might be started by the explosion. People outside the fringe area would not be affected by the blast, heat, or fire, but tens of millions of people would be threatened with radioactive fallout. The thing to remember is that if you know the hazards of a nuclear attack, you can learn the protective steps to take. If, for example, You happen to be out in the open, and there's a brilliant flash of light in the distance. Don't look at it. It may injure your eyes. If possible, take cover immediately. If the explosion were some miles away, you might have 5 to 15 seconds before the heat wave reached you, and perhaps 30 to 60 seconds before the blast wave arrived. By quickly getting inside a nearby building or underneath a highway overpass, you might avoid being seriously burned, or thrown about by the blast, or struck by flying debris. If no solid cover is available, throw yourself on the ground, in a ditch or hollow, behind a tree or a wall, anything that will help to shield you. Curl up in a ball and cover your head with your arms and hands. Stay there until blast and heat waves have passed. Then move to the nearest fallout shelter for protection against radioactive fallout. For those living outside the areas of blast and heat, and this, according to the Department of Defense studies, would include tens of millions of people and probably more than 95% of our land area, fallout would be the principal danger. And if you understand the nature of the danger, you can shield yourself against it. When a nuclear weapon explodes near the ground, great quantities of pulverized earth and debris are sucked up into the nuclear cloud. There, radioactive gases produced by the explosion condense on and into this debris, producing radioactive particles no larger than a grain of salt or sand. These particles can be spread by the winds over hundreds of miles before falling back to Earth. Wherever they settle, they give off invisible gamma rays, like X-rays, that can cause serious radiation sickness, even death. Areas close to a nuclear explosion might receive heavy fallout within 15 to 30 minutes. In communities 100 or 200 miles away, it might take 5 hours, 10, or even longer before the radioactive particles begin to drift down to Earth. No special clothing can protect people against gamma radiation, and no special drugs or chemicals can prevent large doses of radiation from causing serious or fatal damage to the cells of the body. Your only solution is in finding shelter. Fallout shelter would be essential during the first hours or days when the danger is at its peak. Generally, the first 24 hours after fallout began settling would be the most dangerous period. After that, the threat would begin to lessen, for fallout loses its radioactivity fairly rapidly. In a few days, or probably 2 weeks at most, it would be safe to emerge from the shelter, at least for short periods of time. Just remember this: there is a defense against radioactive fallout. It lies in finding suitable fallout shelter.
Berg. St. Louis, Seattle.